All right, guys, we are on Hidden Figures, Chapter 8, Read Aloud. This is called The Duration. Though Dorothy loved her new job in Hampton and was proud to be helping her country with the war effort, she missed her children terribly. She sometimes worked 18-hour days, and the demands of jobs made it difficult for her to get home, except during the holidays. And it seemed like that minute she walked through the door at the family house back in Farmville, it was time for her turn around and head back to Newport News. When she could go home, and the back and forth lifestyle was taking a toll. Dorothy wanted something more permanent. Like most of the computers at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, Dorothy was a temporary service employee. She didn't know when or if the laboratory would offer her a permanent job. Dorothy knew that she wanted her future to look like this, so in July of 1944, she signed a new lease on a new 2-bedroom apartment in Newsom Park. Dorothy wanted her children eventually to live with her for good in Newport News. This 2-bedroom apartment would be a start. But finding the right house hadn't been easy. There weren't enough homes available to meet the demands of the growing African American population. Dorothy chose a neighborhood where she had been living for the previous 9 months. It included black families from all income levels. Domestic workers lived next door, lawyers next to them, small business owners next to civil servant mathematicians. All were welcome. Dorothy's new home was identical to the 2,000 others that had been built in the same subdivision. Newsom Park was also designed to keep morale high among the wartime workers who had to work long hours under stressful conditions. The Newsom Park residents loved their neighborhood. The Newsom Park residents loved that their neighborhood had a community center with a kitchen and a banquet space, rooms for club meetings, and basketball and tennis courts. They had a baseball diamond, and the shopping center included a grocery store, drugstore, barbershop, beauty parlors, cleaners, and had a TV repair shop. A nursery school and a new elementary school were in walking distance from her new apartment. Dorothy's mother-in-law tried to discourage the move. "You're not going to take my baby," she said to Dorothy. Dorothy only appreciated her mother-in-law's help all the months she had been away, but now she needed her children to be close to her. A year later, Dorothy left Farmville. Her children moved into the apartment with her. They started at Newsom Park Elementary School in the fall of 1944. Her husband continued to travel with his job as a bellman. He came down to visit when he could, but he didn't stay long. By 1945, 5 out of the 10 people in southeastern Virginia worked for the government. Housing development sprawled for miles. The community was built around the business of war, but people were starting to wonder what a defense industry boomtown would be during a time of peace. The answer came on VG Day, Victory over Japan Day, on August 14, 1945 at 7 p.m. Newscasters announced that the World War II was over. All over town, soldiers and civilians streamed it into the streets. Business owners locked their doors and joined the celebration that went on through the night. People paraded down the streets and workers held hands to form human chains as they danced around the cars. Makeshift confetti rained down from the windows on the streets below. But after the initial celebrations and parties, uncertainty settled in. 3 weeks after VG Day, the Norfolk Journal and Guide reported layoffs of 1,500 Newport News shipyard workers and a decrease for women workers, both white and colored. Returning servicemen were expected to have their first claim on the job that remained in the peacetime economy. With the return of the men who had been fighting overseas, the demand for the women workers dropped. 2 million Americans, women, black and white alike, received pink slips or notices that they'd be losing their job, even before the war officially ended. Some women looked forward to going home. Others enjoyed their job and their paychecks. They didn't want to go back to the traditional female roles in the kitchen and nursery. Many husbands will return home to find that the helpless little wives they had left behind become grown independent women. Almost immediately after the VJ Day, some employees returned to their policies of not hiring African Americans. With the labor market changing, the dream that many black leaders had of establishing permanent economic opportunities began to slip away. No one was more opposed to opening hiring policies than African Americans. Harry Byrd, who called the policy the most dangerous idea ever considered, Byrd's family had built a newspaper and apple-growing fortune, and he treated segregation as a religion. He had a political machine that kept the poor of all races divided against one another. Dorothy, like so many of the others, had to come to Hampton Roads during the war, didn't want to return to her former life. She assumed that she was going to keep her job and continue to work. It wasn't a risk-free bet. Dorothy committed to the lease on the apartment in Newsom Park before Langley converted her wartime employee status to the permanent civil service employee. She didn't want to wait to put down the roots in her new home, even though it soon became apparent that losing her apartment was still a possibility. Dorothy and the others who lived in the neighborhood learned that some local officials wanted to demolish Newsom Park and redevelop the neighborhood, and federal employees planned to pry the houses off their foundation and send them to the war-devastated populations in Europe. The residents went back and forth with the government over status of their neighborhood, which they had come to love. The government said the Newsom Park was not temporarily in character, yet not permanent in its current location. Though they lived in a state of limbo, the people of Newsom Park was determined to do everything they could to keep their community alive. Life in the Newsport News was an adjustment for Dorothy's children, who missed their small-town freedom and the space at a big house in Farmville. But as the months passed, the family settled in. Dorothy had become quite close to her fellow West computer, Mary and Mann. They were friends both at work and at home, and their families became like one extended family. When Dorothy and Marian learned that the famous African-American singer Marian Anderson was going to perform at Hampton Institute, the women made plans for their families to go together. On that day of the performance, Dorothy looked over at her children, who were interested by Anderson's beautiful voice. Dorothy knew this moment was one for her family would never forget. She knew they were home. So after that chapter, I want you to think, was it fair that African Americans and women now were just not going to have jobs, and they were just dropped from the jobs that they had worked hard for and moved for just because the war was over and the men were coming back?